There were 5 of them, well-dressed. They had surgical gloves, camera film, and tear gas guns. The goal was not to be caught, but they unwittingly failed. It was 2:30 a.m. in the morning. The date was Saturday, June 17th, 1972. This was just the beginning of a scandal that would bring down the President of the United States and all involved. Watergate.
Good evening. We have a mystery story out of Washington. 5 people have been arrested and charged with breaking into the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee in the middle of the night.
The Democratic National Committee is located in the Watergate office building. The burglars forced a stairwell door, then taped its latch open. The door, now part of police evidence, was noticed by one of the guards employed by the Watergate complex. At first, the police found nothing. Then they spied 5 men crouching behind some desks.
Neither the president, obviously, or anybody in the White House, or anybody in authority in any of the committees working for the re-election of the president have any responsibility for it.
That was a lie, and they all knew. This was scandalous and it was bad. Who was involved and who knew what had happened? Well, just 2 days after those arrests were made, former Attorney General John Mitchell denied any links to this operation. And also, John Mitchell was the head of the committee to re-elect the president, which in an acronym would be CREEP. But even though he confidently denied any link to this mysterious break-in at DNC headquarters, his wife, Mrs. Martha Mitchell, was very loquacious. And so behold, the first Watergate whistleblower. I'm Jeremiah Patterson, and this is Disgrace. Disgrace is a podcast about Watergate and corruption at the top echelons of the federal government. On this episode, I will talk about Martha Mitchell and how she was the first one to blow the whistle about the Watergate scandal. Sit tight, more ahead. If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. It is 100% free. There is creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right here in the app. Anchor will distribute your podcast to all the other podcasting platforms, including the big ones like Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and many more. You can make money from your podcast here on Anchor by asking your listeners to donate money. And also, when your listeners listen to ads, you will make money yourself as a podcaster. It's everything you need to make a podcast in one place. No extra equipment required. You don't even need a microphone. You can just record at your phone. So download the free Anchor app today or get started at anchor.fm/start. Once again, that is anchor.fm/start. Being a whistleblower is a very lonely road, especially if you yourself are the only one doing it. Whistleblowers reveal evidence about someone or something that is surreptitiously engaged in corrupt and scandalous behavior. And after the Watergate scandal broke loose and was nationally known, Martha Mitchell was that whistleblower. She told everything. Here's a Saturday Night Live skit back in the 1970s.
One ringy-dingy. 2 ringy-dingies.
Hello.
Oh, gracious, good afternoon. Is this the party to whom I am speaking?
Yes, this is Martha Mitchell.
Oh, well, Mrs. Mitchell, this is Miss Tomlin from the telephone company. We have voted you the person who has done the most for Ma Bell, and your prize is a telephone in the shape of the Supreme Court.
Well, that'll make hanging it up a real pleasure.
So we have here Martha Mitchell, the wife of John Mitchell, which is a former U.S. Attorney General, and he was the head of the committee to re-elect the president. So she knew everything. Nevertheless, she told everything. She was friends with lots of reporters and always gave them an inside scoop on what was coming out. And that produced a bombshell story. Martha Mitchell was a public figure and a forthright conservative. She was nicknamed the Mouth of the South for her very loquacious calls with her friends, which were reporters. She was able to do that because she habitually listened in to her husband's phone calls and meetings. Looking back on the Watergate scandal now, we know that the 5 men who broke into the DNC headquarters were on the presidential payroll. And actually, that was their second time breaking in, illegally entering this office. Elizabeth Macaulay from allthat'sinteresting.com writes, quote, "1 month prior, they had stolen documents and unsuccessfully tried to tap the phones. This time around, they had come back to fix the faulty wiretap and were caught red-handed." End quote. Meanwhile, while that ignominious event was transpiring, Mrs. Martha Mitchell and her husband, Mr. John Mitchell, took a trip to California. And while they were on that trip, John Mitchell got a phone call. The call was about what had just happened at the DNC headquarters. After that call, John Mitchell did something a bit odd, or rather secretive. He feared that his loquacious wife, with a network of reporters, would divulge some information about that call. So he called a professional to keep his wife under control. And I think more specifically, when you look at this from a historic perspective, John Mitchell, I think John Mitchell wanted to keep his wife out of this because John Mitchell knew a lot. Or perhaps John Mitchell had insight on what had just transpired at the DNC headquarters. So he calls this professional to keep his wife under control. He asked a former FBI agent and a member of the committee to re-elect the president, which was Steve King. He asked him to keep a close eye on Martha Mitchell and to keep her away from any newspapers, and of course, any phones. But there was still something odd about this, right? I mean, why was John Mitchell going through all of this trouble to keep his wife silent? Why was he being so secretive about this? What was he doing, and why was he doing it? Maybe John Mitchell feared something, or perhaps knew the rationale behind the break-in at the DNC headquarters, unless he himself was involved. Hey guys, I have 2 other podcasts. The other one is called The Jeremiah Patterson Show, where I discuss news, politics, and history, and the other podcast is about U.S. presidents, where I discuss our nation's presidents from 1 through 44 and provide you an intrinsically valuable piece of history. Thanks for listening. Let's get back to the show. Keeping Martha Mitchell silent about this whole thing was not going to be easy, and Steve King would be no exception. After that break-in at DNC headquarters attracted national news coverage, Martha Mitchell got her hands on a newspaper and learned of James McCord's arrest. Now, if you're bewildered, James McCord is the former CIA officer who was among one of the 5 men arrested in the Watergate break-in. In the newspaper, Martha read that her husband had explicitly lied about whether McCord was on the committee to re-elect the president. Immediately after Mrs. Mitchell had learned of this mendacious statement from her husband, she tried to call him and demand an explanation for why he was being mendacious and sort of secretive about this. But she didn't get the chance. She was rejected by a Nixon aide. In fact, it got so bad that Steve King was so infuriated that he decided to rip the phone out of the wall. And apparently Steve King did more than that. In an interview with David Frost, an English journalist, she recalled being held captive at a local hotel in California for 4 days. And during those 4 days, she said she was beaten, kicked, and restrained in her bed while vigorously tranquilized by a psychiatrist. Meanwhile, John Mitchell worked with the President of the United States, President Richard Nixon, to cover up the Watergate scandal. Martha Mitchell was the first to indicate and imply that the cover-up went all the way to the top echelons of the federal government. Martha Mitchell would go on to live until 1976 at the age of 57 from a rare bone cancer. She was, quote, alone and destitute, end quote, as someone described. And before Martha Mitchell died in 1976, she had divorced her husband, John Mitchell. So looking back on this now from intrinsically historical, from a historical perspective, Martha Mitchell. So in 1972, Richard Nixon gets reelected president of the United States. Martha Mitchell has already been married to John Mitchell for quite some time. John Mitchell is the head of the committee to re-elect the President of the United States. Subsequently, these 5 men are arrested at DNC headquarters for not once, but this is their second time breaking in to DNC headquarters, trying to surreptitiously gather information on the Democratic Party. And so this guy comes out and he claims that no one on the committee to re-elect the president of the United States had any insight of this. No one knew about this. No one knew this was planned, and no one knew this was even going to transpire. Not even the president himself. Meanwhile, John Mitchell, the head of the committee to re-elect the president, he himself gets a call in California about this whole thing, and he tries to silence his wife. And he tells other people to help him in this effort to silence his wife, because she's friends with lots of reporters, and she has a whole network of reporters as her friends. And so John Mitchell is trying to do this to keep his wife silent. Meanwhile, Martha Mitchell does inevitably get her hand on a newspaper, and she learns about this mendacious statement from her husband. And she is infuriated, and she's like, why is my husband lying about this when he knows very well that James McCord was on the committee to re-elect the president? And so it turns out into just like physical abuse and trying in the effort to keep Mrs. Martha Mitchell silent. But that is the story of the first Watergate whistleblower. Here's how the famous reporter Helen Thomas recalls her interactions with Mrs. Mitchell.
I really feel there'll be many more chapters with Martha Mitchell. She's such a colorful person and such a warm human, compassionate. I've seen her really get involved in so many things. No one ever asked her to do anything but what she didn't do it. You know, little people with big causes and everything. She was always there.
Martha Mitchell was perspicacious. She knew everything. She saw everything. And she told everything. And while she attempted to do it, while she attempted to divulge all the information that she knew and all that she knew on habitually listening into her husband's phone calls, she was simultaneously threatened and deliberately kept quiet because she knew too much. This is not the only chapter in this scandalous book, but there is more and lots to uncover. And that will be on tomorrow's episode 3. I'm Jeremiah Patterson, and thank you for listening to this episode of Disgrace. Thank you for listening to episode 2, The Mouth of the South. My sources for this episode are listed in the description. Join me tomorrow for episode 3. Stay safe and take care.